We're in Galatians. Been here for a while. Paul says, continuing his conversation, let me put it like this. As long as the heir is a child, he is no different from a slave. And if even, in fact, he is master of everything. He is kept under guardians and stewards until the time set by the Father. And it's like that with us. When we were children, we were kept in slavery under the elements of the world. But when the time of fulfillment arrived, God sent out His Son, born of a woman, born under the law, so that He might redeem those who are under the law, so that we might receive adoption as sons. And because you are sons, God sent out the Spirit of His Son into our hearts, calling out, Abba, Father. So you are no longer a slave, but a child. And if you are a child, you are an heir through God. However, at that stage, you didn't know God. And so you were enslaved to beings that in their proper nature are not God's. But now that you've come to know God, or better, to be known by God, how can you turn back again to that weak and poverty-stricken lineup that went to serve, that you want to serve it all over again? You are observing days and months and seasons and years. I'm afraid for you. Perhaps my hard work with you is all going to be wasted. Become like me, because I became like you, my dear family. This is my plea to you. You didn't wrong me. No, you know that it was through the bodily weaknesses that I announced the gospel to you in the first place. You didn't despise or ridicule me, even though my condition was quite a test for you. But you welcomed me as if I were God's angel, as if I were the Messiah, Jesus. This is the word of the Lord.
Thanks be to God.
I've always liked the French Impressionists. Or even just the Impressionists, Van Gogh, Renoir, Degas. In the 1880s, 100 years earlier, in Paris, the French painter Renoir overheard a conversation with another French painter, Degas. Because that's what they did. They all hung out together in French cafes. And Renoir overhears Degas talking with a friend of his, and they're talking about the telephone, which had just been recently invented, and it had made its way over to Paris. And Degas asks his friend, so when it rings, you get up and answer it? And his friend says, as soon as it rings, I get up and I answer it. And Degas goes, so just like a servant then. And the bell rings, you get up and you go to attend to it, right? And, well, that was 1890. I imagine what Degas would say today, 130 years later. I mean, if he could only see us now. And when it comes to phone, there's a generational divide among us. Some people, when the cell phone rings, they answer it. They know the number, they don't know the number. It can even say scam risk on it. They'll still answer it. And then there are others, they never answer the cell phone. But they'll jump on any text that pops up. And any kind of notification that might deem, my wife and my daughters, they text each other all day long. I mean, they're working, they're not doing it constantly, but it's this conversation starts with a few words, and during the day, another couple of words pops up, and then another couple of words in a picture. It's just a thing that goes on between them. And sometimes I get in there. I'm not in there nearly as often. It's mostly the women. My wife and my daughters, they're having these conversations. Sometimes they pull me in, and I respond. And I remember one time I responded and I replied, and I hit send. Somehow it popped up on Jeff Neville's phone. At the same time, it popped up on everybody else's. He gets it. And his phone starts blowing up with all these women on it. And, how did that happen? our phones. But I'm not going to let it control my life. I'm not, but they got us, don't they? Verizon, Sprint, all that, they got us. They got us over a barrel. Bob Dylan once sang a song, "Got to Serve Somebody." I don't know if any of you are fans of Bob Dylan. I actually do like him. He's not really a good singer, but he's a great songwriter. In his 1979 album, Slow Train Coming, he wrote this song, "Got to Serve Somebody." And our first reading this morning from Joshua, familiar verse to some of you, "Choose today whom you will serve. But as for me and my household, we will serve the Lord." Bob Dylan says, you're going to have to serve somebody. You may be ambassador to England or France, but you got to serve somebody. You may be rich or poor. You may be blind or lame, but you're going to have to serve somebody. Yes, you're going to have to serve somebody. Well, it may be the devil or it may be the Lord, but you're going to have to serve somebody. The song keeps on going. There's the old joke about what would happen if an alien came down, and watched human beings taking care of their dogs. And walking their dogs and getting dragged and pulled by their dogs and feeding their dogs and throwing treats to their dogs and picking up the poop that their dogs poop and carrying it around in little bags. And well, you know who's in charge around here, don't you? That's another little favorite of mine is the graffiti that said, "Spread anarchy." And then someone else obviously had crossed through that and said, "Don't tell me what to do." Nobody wants to be in servitude to anybody else or something else. We all want to be free. And here we are in Galatians, and with Paul, he's confronting the church in Galatia. How they are unwittingly, even unconsciously, become beholden to systems that would enslave them. And he talks about the forgiveness that is ours through faith to the end for which that forgiveness is graciously given, which is namely that the wonderful freedom to be children, not just to be free, but to be children of God and to live as God's people. Here we are in Galatians 4, verse 1. Paul uses a couple of different metaphors. He talks about the air and about the law being like a custodian, like a babysitter kind of situation. And he's saying as long as the heirs are minors, they are no better than slaves, though they are owners of all the property. And he kind of switches metaphors a little bit. He mixes them up. Because one metaphor metaphor is good for up to a point, and then it starts to break down. So Paul keeps on mixing these metaphors. He wants us to see, in one sense, to the Galatians, if you are Jewish, the law is your guardian, which kept you on track. But it was all in anticipation of this day, he's saying, when you would become full heirs of the promise, which is in Christ, he's been saying. But then he switches gears and he says, but really, if we're to be honest, it wasn't as if you were an heir. It was as if you were a slave. And this is a metaphor that would have sung. The Jewish people celebrated the law. They wrote poetry about having delight in the law. And they told this wonderful story. And they tell this wonderful story of rescue and of deliverance and of being yanked out of enslavement and oppression. The law and the Exodus, it's an exciting story of freedom. And isn't that the point anyway? I mean, right? Isn't it the point that we be free? I mean, isn't it just over when Israel finally lands on solid ground on the other side of the sea, and they're singing in their great triumphal song, "Let me sing unto the Lord, for he has surged, O surged, horse and its rider, he's hurled into the sea." And they're singing, and there's this wonderful, exuberant joy at being free, finally. Free at last, thank God Almighty, we're free at last. So, the problem's solved, it's all over, the story of Exodus. Except that it isn't. Our problem is that we think Israel's problem is that they were our slaves. Our problem is to think that the thing that Hebrews needed most of all was to be free. To us, freedom is the ultimate goal. Freedom is the American God we worship without question. Nobody tells me what to do. Nobody tells us what to do. I will not be constrained. I will do what I want to do. I'm free. But he's got a point. Slavery is a problem. The problem with Israel's enslavement, it's right there in the story. It's a problem, and God hears their cry. In the Hebrew, the word slave can appear in a number of different forms and can mean a number of different things. It can appear as a noun, and it can mean servant, or it can mean slave. It can appear, and so the servant or slave, it's the same word but with different meaning. It can be a verb. It can mean to work. It can mean to enslave, and it can mean to worship. And depending on what the context is, the problem with the Hebrews is that they serve Pharaoh. They are slaves to Pharaoh. They are working for Pharaoh. All the same word. One word. The fascinating thing I like to notice about this Hebrew word is that work and worship are the same thing. I mean, they're included. Not exactly the same thing, but they come from the same root word. The idea that work and the idea of worship are not separate ideas. In the book of Exodus, slavery is a problem, yes, but it's not the problem. In chapter 1 of Egypt, we begin to get an inkling. We get a clue right up front in the very beginning, and we hear, and a new king rose over Egypt, and knew not Joseph. And then we're beginning to already get a clue. There's a problem. The problem for the people of Israel is that they are working for the wrong king. They are attached to the wrong king. They're serving the wrong king. They're worshiping the wrong king. And Paul is drawing on this story. I mean, they didn't have a New Testament back then. Their Bible was the Old Testament, and Paul is drawing from these stories of the Old Testament. And if you're old enough, you can remember Cecil B. DeMille's 1956 film, The Ten Commandments. You can all, most all of you can remember that if you've ever gone to the movies or watched TV. It used to show up every season leading up to Easter. I don't know that it does anymore. Or maybe if you're younger, you might remember The Prince of Egypt. There's a famous line that gets quoted in both movies that gets your attention because it's used in the movies, where Moses says to Pharaoh, "Let my people go." And you can hear Charlton Heston say that right now. And that's the line that gets quoted, but it's only the first part of the line. There's more to it. What it really says, what it does say, is Moses said, is, "Let my people go that they may worship me, that they may work for me, that they may serve me." So it was never, now we are free and we can do whatever we want to do and nobody can tell us what to do. It was never about that. It's, now I'm free to serve, to work for, to worship the Lord. And it's the point that Paul's making in Galatians. Jesus gave himself and by his sacrifice to set us free from this present evil age. And there's no question about that we live in an evil age. And gave himself according to the will of our Father and God. The gospel is Lord God Almighty delivering, saving, rescuing from this present evil age a people for himself. Saving them, providing for their forgiveness of sins, in order that they may live for him as children of God in this present evil age. And you know the story, the way it goes. Israel was enslaved to Pharaoh. They were rescued from Pharaoh. They were set free from their service to Pharaoh. At Mount Sinai, there is this betrothal scene where God makes promises to Israel. Israel makes promises to God. And they say to one another, I will be faithful to you. And God says, you will become for me a treasure among all the peoples. And you will become for me a kingdom of priests and a holy nation. So yes, free. Free now to serve the true and rightful King. That's the Exodus story, but it's only half of the story. It's the one the movies tell us, but it's only half of the story. With the honeymoon barely behind them and the wedding cake just put into the refrigerator, the worst possible thing that could happen happens. At the worst moment in the second half of the whole book of Exodus, Israel slides back into enslavement. Israel falls back into the stupor of slavery by making an idol. When Moses appears down from the mountain, they argue, no, Moses, this is not a false God. We swear it's not. It's still Yahweh, they want to say. And we're not being unfaithful. And this is the festival of Yahweh. Can't you tell? And the problem was that it was a false image of the true God. It wasn't a false image of a false God. However, it was still false. It was still a betrayal. So it's an amazing story of the Lord having taken Israel to himself, saying, I will be your God, and giving them law. And we have this wonderful story of salvation. But just like Israel, we're just like them. We much prefer our own version of God. It's still God. It's still Yahweh. I swear. Except it's a false image of the true God. And if these past few years have shown us anything, it's stripped us of any illusion of where our loyalties lie. Progressive Christians, liberal Christians, conservative Christians, by the millions, masters at self-deception in fashioning golden calf images for themselves. And this sin causes all kinds of relationship problems and all kinds of intimacy problems and relationship problems between neighbors and brothers and sisters and between us and between God and God who wants to be with us. God who made promises to us and said and has promised to be faithful to us. And then with the Israelites, it's so bad. Moses given instruction to put the temple outside the camp, away from the people. It's the problem as the book of Exodus comes to its end. This is the big problem. There are very serious intimacy problems. Things aren't working out. Our sin looms so large. The marriage is on the rocks. Nothing is as God had wanted it to be. The Hebrew people are unfaithful. The tabernacle where God resides is outside the camp. And the whole book of Exodus has been building up to this point at the end of the book where finally the tabernacle it's been built. So much detail and so much energy and so much effort, and finally it's up. And they look, and the cloud covered the tent of meeting, and the glory of the Lord filled the temple. And there it is. And we finally get at that point where, it's there. Let's all go up to the tent of meeting and let us worship God. And Moses is there, and the book says Moses could not come into the tent of meeting. the way is closed. Moses, the greatest Old Testament figure in the Bible, can't go in. That's how Exodus ends. Moses can't go in. And if Moses, the greatest, can't go in, then who can approach God? No one. I love the way Leviticus is the next book in the Bible. Genesis, Exodus, Leviticus. I love the way Leviticus begins. We think of Leviticus as a boring book, and it is kind of. But it's also gospel. Leviticus is the gospel of the Old Testament. But I love the way it begins. Moses is standing outside the tent, and God calls to Moses from inside the tent. And all the rest of the book of Leviticus is the answer to what happens there. The problem is not just that the Hebrew people were enslaved to Pharaoh, and all they needed to be was set free. The problem was that their hearts were far from God, and not even the law could help them. Sin had taken hold of the law, and malformed what was good, and turned it into a tool for enslaving Israel, which was Paul's point. The law cannot transform the human heart under the power of sin. The law can and does function as a relentless slave master, condemning, accusing, exposing, and shaming, and killing. That's the power of the law. But that was not God's intent. That's not the intent of the law. The law was an expression of God's love, but because of the flaw in the human heart, the law has become a slave master. Paul wants us to know. You are observing the special days and the months and the seasons and years. You're going back into all those things that you left behind. Really? And how can you turn back again to the weak and beggarly elemental spirits? And how can you want to be enslaved to them again after what you've been given? The point that Paul's driving home is, we were slaves, and we're so easily still enslaved. We can't just look at slavery as a thing, as a slavery thing, and think, that's all over now. We've got Jesus, and that was before I knew Christ, and I was once a slave, but now I'm free. And there's an old saying that you can get Israel out of Egypt, but you can't get Egypt out of Israel. It's an ever-present danger. The problem isn't behind us, it's right in front of us. We were and we are still too eager to fashion golden calves for ourselves. We are still very enthusiastically and exuberantly ready to be enslaved all over again. Paul says to the Galatians, you are enslaved to things. You were enslaved to things that are not God's. You were, but you've been set free in Christ, free to serve the Lord. And we're seeing through Paul's eyes a church that was a mess, enslaved by sin to the law, which condemns and accuses us, enslaved by our allegiance and loyalty to worldly, social, and political systems and powers and voices, and following after our own appetites, enslaved by false gods, enslaved even to false images of the true God. Why are you going back to slavery? Paul wants to know. But we want to say, Paul, we're Americans. We're not enslaved. We love freedom. We're Christians too. We love freedom. Nobody is going to tell us, take that from us. Paul wants to know, really? Offer this to you in the name of the Father, Son, and Holy